Yeah, forgive me, I'm trying to remember something that happened quite a bit of time ago, and as you get older, your memory starts to go. But I've got about 10 years ago, I met a young Baptist chaplain at the United States Army Chaplaincy School named Brian. Every time I asked Brian how he was doing, he would just smile ear to ear the way only a Texan can and say, "You know what, Josh? God is great, man." And it wasn't just a put on either. When Brian had a tense fight with his boss, what did he have to say? "God is great, man." When he learned about problems at his kid's school, "God is great, man." When he tore his ACL at PT, "God is great, man." Regardless of what was happening in his life, good or bad, Brian could always find a way, as he said, to give it up to God. Though I applauded Brian's determination, I got to admit, at first I was a bit skeptical. Brian's willingness to give it up to God reminded me a little too much of those superstitious beliefs which assign responsibility for everyday occurrences to God, an ideology which is at best insensitive and at worst insulting. Soon, every time Brian would tell me, "God is great, man," quaint images began dancing in my head of NFL players thanking Jesus for that game-winning touchdown drive, and Facebook posts of people thanking God for a new 2-story house or a brand new sports car. And those thoughts, however, were soon replaced by less benign images, a priest telling a weeping father that his 16-year-old son's death was part of God's plan, or an ambitious pastor blaming California wildfires on the state's acceptance of LGBTQ individuals. I'm sure you can think of a few examples from your own lives as well. Clearly, this very seemingly Christian habit of assigning responsibility for everyday occurrences to God can have dreadful implications. It can give us a false sense of our own importance. It can trivialize human suffering, and it can even discourage us from taking responsibility for the very things we're most responsible for. So it was a little embarrassing then when I finally recognized that this behavior isn't really Christian at all. In fact, it's a very Jewish tradition too. From Baruch Hashem to God willing to thanks be to God. We Jews ascribe a lot of everyday occurrences, at least in our speech, to divine intervention. And the habit began quite early in our people's history. In this week's Parsha, Vayigash, Joseph divulges his true identity to his brothers, reassuring them that they need not feel any remorse or guilt over selling him into slavery all those years ago because, quote, "It was God who sent me here ahead of you in order to save lives." Talk about giving it up to God right there. I mean, Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, and because of that, he spent a good chunk of his 20s in prison. Now the brothers are back, and all Joseph has to say for himself is, "You know what? God is great, man." Really? I mean, really? But let's consider for a moment what Joseph accomplishes with this statement. By consigning responsibility for his fate to God rather than his brothers, Joseph, in an ideological sense anyway, elevates his own status from a victim of his brother's jealousy to that of an essential cog in God's plan for the world. By ascribing his journey to God, Joseph isn't just pinning his fortunes, good or bad, on divine intervention. He's recognizing that he has a purpose, that his misfortunes and fortunes alike could all serve a greater good. He could restore a broken family. He could feed the hungry. He could save lives. By giving it up to God, Joseph frees himself to be his best self. Insults, threats, even confrontations with the brothers who sold him into slavery can't shake him. While the exaltation and honor afforded to his newfound status as the viceroy of Egypt cannot unnerve him. It's not that he's devoid of emotion. In fact, our sages later teach that it's impossible for even the most pious Jew to eschew feelings of anger or resentment when we're injured or insulted. But Joseph has a purpose to fulfill. He knows who he is. He knows what he must do. And he knows that when push comes to shove, he doesn't have the time for pettiness or revenge. He has to get on with his job. Unlike the naive mind who ascribes every daily incident to God in the hopes that God will somehow ultimately provide the solution to life's many problems for us, Joseph doesn't relinquish control of his life to God. Instead, Joseph uses God to take control of his own life, a life whose direction had been left up to this point in practically everyone else's hands. Joseph's father made him the favorite. Joseph's brothers made him a slave. Joseph's employer made him a prisoner. Joseph's sovereign made him a prince. But now, finally given the opportunity to react against all those people who had acted upon him, Joseph chooses a different route. He chooses to give it up to God. And in so doing, he embraces a sacred purpose, one that guides him through all the challenges to come, from his confrontation with his brothers to the death of his father Jacob. The renowned psychiatrist Viktor Frankl knew better than anyone how important it is to find a purpose. After 3 years in Nazi concentration camps, during which he lost his wife, his brother, and his parents, Frankl began to ask how certain people were able to maintain a sense of hope and inner strength, even in the worst of situations, while others, even in situations that were far less dire, could not. In a famous book, Man's Search for Meaning, he suggests that while we might not be able to control our circumstances, while we can't control what happens to us, we always possess the power to control ourselves, to control who we want to be, to find a sense of purpose that grants our lives meaning. God bless you. And there's another one. This was the secret behind Joseph's decision to give it up to God. And I later realized it was also the secret behind Brian's insistent refrain. Yes, giving it up to God can sound almost the same as that painfully naive habit of laying every happenstance, good or bad, at God's feet. But the words don't matter nearly as much as what we do with them. When we invite God into our lives, not as a crutch, but as an inspiration. When we give it up to God, not in a way that infantilizes us, but empowers us. Then, like Joseph and like Brian, we can say with confidence, you know what? God is great, man. May this be the God we experience this Shabbat and in all those Shabbats to come. Shabbat Shalom.